Like I keep saying, brutal. It was a two-footed tackle. He just went straight in and said, "We are no longer going to pay for your defence. This is your responsibility." He said in terms, "Grow up, grow something,
Yeah.
and get on with it."
In Brussels today, there's been a meeting of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group. This oversees the coordination of weapons delivered to Kyiv. Previously chaired by the US, the meeting will be chaired for the first time by the UK, actually. Here is Defence Secretary John Healey speaking earlier.
President Trump and President Zelensky have both spoken of their desire to achieve peace through strength. And it's the commitments here through this contact group that provide the strength to achieve that peace. And our job as defence ministers is to put into the hands of the Ukrainian war fighters what they need to fight and what they need to help force Putin to the negotiating table.
Well, he was joined by the new US Secretary of Defence, Pete Hegseth.
As the war approaches its third anniversary, our message is clear. The bloodshed must stop, and this war must end. President Trump has been clear with the American people and with many of your leaders that stopping the fighting and reaching an enduring peace is a top priority. He intends to end this war by diplomacy and bringing both Russia and Ukraine to the table.
Pete Hegseth. So much controversy about him, but he is the US Secretary of Defence. Tim Marshall joins us now, foreign affairs expert, author and former foreign correspondent. So, Tim, what's your assessment of what has been said there? Pete Hegseth, he's a figure who is, to say the least, controversial. And that phrase, enduring peace, honestly, what are the chances of enduring peace in the near future between Russia and Ukraine?
Limited. And you asked for my reaction. I just went on Twitter and said the United States has just gone in with a two-footed tackle, studs up, straight over the shin bone of the European countries. I mean, it was brutal. I was listening to it as he was speaking. It was brutal. Brutal for the Ukrainians and brutal for the Europeans. He said the 2014 borders are not possible. So, there is no way in hell America is going to back anything where Ukraine tries to get back the territory that has been seized from it. He described that as an illusory goal. And then he said, when it comes to the peacekeeping, because they're going to deliver apparently the peace, maybe.
Yeah.
It's no way in hell are American troops going to be peacekeepers in this. It will be, and it was an interesting phrase, capable European and non-European troops. So I think behind the scenes they've had a word, including with the British, because the two main European militaries are the British and the French. There are other very capable ones, the Finns, the Swedes, the Poles. But he said capable European troops. He then underlined this is not going to be a NATO mission. And he then underlined, and whatever the mission is, it's not going to include Article 5, the NATO Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. So if the Europeans do show up as peacekeepers and get attacked, nothing to do with us, Gov. So the Americans have already said, like I said, it was brutal. I'm sure most of the Europeans knew this was coming, but he laid it out.
Yeah, and you've laid it out. And we need to make people aware, I guess, that this is a pretty significant day, isn't it? We need to really take heed of this. And Tim, do what?
Spend more money. And again, this was something else Hegseth said. And here his tone and even his language, when you know how the diplomats speak to each other, was undiplomatic. I think the Americans have got a very strong case when they say we're sick and tired of paying for your defense. I think they've got a very strong case when they say you've had your heads in the sand with how much you've been spending. But it was, like I keep saying, brutal. It was a two-footed tackle. He just went straight in and said, we are no longer going to pay for your defense. This is your responsibility. He said in terms, grow up, grow something, and get on with it. And on it went. It was only 7 minutes, but it went on and on. And so, sorry, to answer your question, Trump has said you guys should be spending 5% of your GDP on defense. Well, that is a non-starter. A third of the NATO countries still don't even reach the 2%. 2% of GDP on defense is nowhere near enough to fill the gaps that the Americans are going to leave if they're not going to help militarily. We're not sure about how many weapons they'll send. But also 2% is nowhere near the revised defense plans for Europe in case that Europe is attacked by, let's just say, Russia. It's just nowhere near. For that, you're going to have a defense spending at 3.5%. Now, apart from Poland, possibly the Baltics and the Swedes and the Finns, the rest of the Europeans, there's no way in hell they're going to spend 3.5%. I mean, Labour's already pretty much ruled it out here. So Ukraine will have listened to all that with absolute horror. They will now turn to the Europeans and say, can you please do what you can?
Well, which of those countries that you've mentioned could do more in the near future, realistically? I mean, is Sir Keir Starmer going to have to double our defence spending?
Yeah, well, we reached 2%, but we kind of cooked the books because we put the intelligence services and GCHQ into the budget, some of it anyway. The British and the French are amongst the most capable European forces. Politically, I think the French could possibly get away with ponying up some troops. I mean, the British, after our experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq, Labour government putting out troops into Eastern Europe. I mean, this has been kicked around for several months now. And I think it's really interesting that John Healey, our defence secretary, is the one that's chairing this meeting. You know, the Americans have passed the ball, handed it off, as they said. They're no longer going to chair this contact group. The Brits are chairing it for the moment, and I think that's a message. So there's a massive decision coming up that if that Trump can get this peace deal, and of course that remains an if, but following on from that is who is going to go and station thousands of troops along the Ukraine-Russian border. Well, actually, along the line of contact, which will be in the Donbass and now near Crimea. Are we? Well, you better get Mr. Starmer on.
Yeah, well, actually, just from what you know of the strength of Britain's armed forces, could we?
Well, we probably could for at least a few weeks. Hopefully we wouldn't have to fire anything in anger because we'd run out of artillery shells after a couple of months, almost certainly, especially 155 millimeter artillery shells, because we've given a lot of them away. And there's a shortage of them around the world because the Ukrainians are firing so many of them. I mean, look, Britain could still possibly field a division. But, you know, we've only got about, 50, 60,000 troops? And if you're suddenly going to put several thousand of them at great cost into the field and potentially at risk, and it is only potentially, I personally think the Russians will be smart enough to wait another 5 years, persuade everybody to go away and then try and finish the job then. So I'll try and sum it up. The Americans have just made it crystal clear. We might still give some weapons, but we're done. We're done on all that because you're going to have to pay for it. You're going to have to do the peacekeeping and you're going to have to defend Europe because, as Hegseth said, we are far more focused on China than we are on Europe. So the Ukrainians are going to have to try somehow to battle themselves into a position that if it comes to negotiations, at least they only lose some of their land.
Well, I was going to ask you, in fact, the next interview we're doing, actually in about half an hour, I should say, 25 minutes or so, is with a great colleague and great friend of the Ukrainian journalist Victoria Amelina, whose book, Looking at Women, Looking at War, has just been published posthumously. She was killed in July of 2023, as I'm sure you know. But the Ukrainians have fought very bravely. They have lost good people. It's been absolutely wretched for them. What are they going to have to give up in order for some sort of peace to be achieved?
All of Crimea, most of the Donbass, and a security deal that is not backed up by NATO or Article 5 or the Americans, which is of some value, depending on how strong the Europeans are in their warnings to the Russians about what will happen if and when it restarts. You remind me of something I think is quite important. I've argued for the past year, sometimes with you, that the Ukrainians will find it almost impossible to carry on fighting without American support unless there's a revolution in European defense spending and aid. So if that happens, they can carry on. Otherwise, they have to go to the table. But there's something else that keeps them there. And Victoria covered this in her work. What happened to the Ukrainians when they were occupied, and the brutality and the murders and the torture and the psychological warfare that people in the occupied areas of the Donbass who are pro-Ukrainian have suffered, has told the rest of the population, this is what will happen to us if and when the Russians show up in our town. And that is a real motivating factor to just keep fighting, because I mean, it really has been utterly brutal what has happened to the Ukrainian people. I mean, the Russians have essentially kidnapped thousands of children and sent them off into Russia. And that's just the bare bones of it. So they are desperate that Russia does not win. They are also exhausted. And so if Trump, his 100 days brings us to May, if by May there can be a peace deal that the Ukrainians think will deter the Russians from a third bite, I should say, this is their second bite, if they really think that the deal secures them for a generation, they might go for it. If they don't, most of them know there's no point. We'll only be fighting again in 5 to 10 years.
Thank you very much indeed for talking to us, Tim. Tim Marshall, an expert on foreign affairs and the author of many great books on all sorts of subjects, notably The Future of Geography is a book that we've talked to Tim about, isn't it? Former BBC foreign correspondent as well.